Welcome to Tales of the Resistance, a podcast highlighting stories of rebellion and defiance in these weird-ass times. I'm Amber Hunt. Let's get to it. Did you daydream this year about not paying those federal taxes? You definitely weren't alone, and it turns out that some people opted to follow through. I'm not saying it's a wise choice. It is very much illegal. But if you're inclined to live vicariously through others' actions, here's the tale for you. Chicago attorney Rachel Cohen has been a vocal critic of the Trump regime. She's been tear-gassed at protests against deportation tactics and even hit with pepper pellets. So when she sat down to do her taxes this year, she said she couldn't square writing the federal government a check for $10,000 with everything she had already put her body on the line for. So she didn't. She filed her taxes, but set the money she owed aside in a savings account and paid only her state taxes. She's one of a growing number of people turning to war tax resistance as a form of civil disobedience.
I'm Rachel, and I'm not paying my federal income tax this year.
It's time that we stop paying our taxes.
Tax Strike 2026. Spread the word.
Lincoln Rice is a Milwaukee organizer with the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, which, to be clear, has been around for decades. But Rice says the group saw a noteworthy uptick this tax season.
Before the invasion of Gaza, we would typically have 40,000 unique users visit our site on an annual basis. This past January, we had the most visits to our website that we've ever had, over 110,000 unique users.
Rice says the groups make sure everyone understands the consequences before they commit. IRS letters, monthly fines, and in extreme cases, wage garnishment or property seizure. In Chicago's Logan Square neighborhood, M. Jacoby runs a small organization that helps tax resistors put their withheld money to work, investing it and using the interest to fund grants for community organizations. She took over the group from an older woman who ran it for 40 years. The board members are in their 70s and 80s. Many joined to protest Vietnam. Now they're being joined by a new generation. Jacoby herself had never withheld her taxes before. This year she did. She said her breaking point was her 7-year-old daughter seeing news coverage of the bombing in Gaza and asking, "We're safe from the bombing here too, aren't we, Mom?" Nito Sharma also withheld, saying,
"Resisting is a privilege and not everyone can resist in the same way. So having options and still being able to take action was great."
She and others are making a point to be public about their choice, despite knowing it might draw IRS scrutiny, but they say that's kind of the point. They want to draw attention to what they're opposing. You know, the government passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act last November, the one that was supposed to force the DOJ to release everything it had on Jeffrey Epstein, his network, and everyone connected to them, and then the DOJ just didn't. Attorney and journalist Katie Fang did something about it.
I'm suing Todd Blanche as the acting attorney general of the United States of America.
Fang is arguing that the DOJ has brazenly and systematically violated a law that Congress passed and Trump himself signed. The act required full document production within 30 days, so by December 19th, 2025. That didn't happen. What did happen? Thousands of documents released late, hundreds of pages completely blacked out with no explanation, victim photos released without redaction, which a victim's attorney called the single most egregious violation of victim privacy in one day in U.S. history, and then crucially, documents referencing Donald Trump pulled down, retracted, or withheld entirely.
I say knowledge is power, but I also endeavor to seek justice in ways that I can. And in one of those ways, it's me bringing good faith litigation against a Department of Justice that is violating the law on the daily and that is actively seeking to hide the truth from the American people about the greatest, most egregious criminal conspiracy in the trafficking of children that has existed in the history of America. And despite there being a federal law that has mandated and required transparency, this Trump regime, in concert with the Trump Department of Justice, repeatedly violates the law. And I'm over it. So I've sued. I am looking forward to the battle.
The complaint is specific about what's missing: a draft indictment with co-conspirators' names redacted, emails to Epstein from unidentified people referencing young girls, and multiple documents, including FBI interview notes from a woman who alleged Trump forced her to perform oral sex when she was a minor, that were either never produced or quietly removed from the DOJ website after public attention. Blanche declared in January that the DOJ fulfilled its obligations under the law. Fang's lawsuit says that's flatly false. She's asking the court to order the DOJ to release everything it's hiding, explain every redaction, and appoint a special master to oversee compliance. In other words, to do the thing the law already requires. There was apparently another assassination attempt last weekend. 130 veterans and military family members held a solemn protest in the Capitol Rotunda on April 20th, demanding that the Trump administration end its war on Iran and that Congress stop funding it. The veterans, many of them Iraq and Afghanistan vets, conducted a flag-folding ceremony and played taps on a bugle in honor of the 13 service members already killed in the conflict. They unfurled banners reading "End the War on Iran" and "We can't afford another war."
As a veteran, I know the harm that wars do to civilian populations, but also to our soldiers.
This is vet Christina Sarson, interviewed by Reuters.
I'm talking about the loss of life. I'm talking about injuries and lives changed forever. I'm talking about PTSD and moral injury. We heard the same promises and the same excuses and reasoning for the Iraq war that we're hearing today. And they're shifting constantly to justify our presence in the Middle East. And we're not fooled. We as veterans know better.
At least 60 people were arrested, including elderly and disabled activists. They face charges like crowding, obstructing, or incommoding, as protests are prohibited inside congressional buildings. Public polling shows 53% of voters oppose U.S. military action against Iran, while 74% oppose sending ground troops. When Trump spent more than a year pressuring Republican-controlled states to redraw congressional maps ahead of the midterms, Virginia voters decided they'd like a say in that, and they didn't stutter. On April 22nd, Virginians approved a redistricting referendum narrowly backing a new congressional map drawn by the state's Democratic-led legislature. About 51.5% voted yes. The approved map would shift Virginia's congressional delegation dramatically, giving Democrats a shot at winning 10 of the state's 11 congressional seats compared to the current 6-5 split. Now, if you'll remember, this move was a reactionary one that started last year with a mid-cycle Texas redistricting plan that was adopted without a vote. Here's Virginia State Senator L. Louise Lucas explaining.
I watched what was happening in Texas. Republican legislators trying to rig the system before voters ever had a chance to speak. And I watched those Texas legislators take a stand, even leaving their state to stop that power grab. I stood with them. Because what was happening in Texas wasn't just about Texas, it was about the rest of the country. And I said right then and right there, clearly, if they start this fight, Virginia is going to finish it.
That's a decidedly more family-friendly version of what she said in a tweet that went viral. Look it up. The vote has national implications. Texas's redistricting move was countered by California's, which was also voter-approved, which has now been bolstered by Virginia's. Indiana GOP lawmakers refused Trump's insistence that they follow Texas's lead. Long story short, analysts say Democrats have now clawed back an edge in roughly 10 seats nationwide, largely erasing what Republican gerrymandering was supposed to lock in. Will it hit SCOTUS? Yeah, probably. But the conservative majority there has already ruled that political gerrymandering is A-OK. You just can't do it for racial reasons. So a ruling that counters what's been done in Virginia might undo what the GOP has done elsewhere. So the legal fights aren't finished, but Virginia voters, at least, have spoken. While Harvard's administration fights Trump in federal court, a different fight broke out on campus recently, and the two are more connected than they might seem. More than 4,000 graduate student workers at Harvard walked off the job on April 21st, halting teaching, grading, and laboratory research after 15 months of contract negotiations stalled. The union is demanding a minimum salary of $55,000. Research assistants currently earn just over $40,000, and teaching fellows as little as $26,300, along with third-party arbitration for harassment cases and stronger protections for international students facing visa threats. This is Noah Ferris, Crimson staff writer.
Harvard and its grad students have been bargaining for 15 months and have only agreed on two things: vacation time and workplace materials. In the final session before the strike deadline, Harvard responded to just one of the union's four proposals, and union leaders called the meeting disappointing. That was enough for the 4,000-strong union to walk out. The next session isn't until April 28th. The UAW strike fund, for what it's worth, kicks in after the first week, paying members $500 a week. When HGSU went on strike in 2021, it reached a contract after 3 days. In 2019, it took 29 days. Teaching and grading have been interrupted, and many classes were canceled this week or moved virtually. Several academic events also saw disruption. Many faculty are refusing to hire replacement workers in hopes of not undermining the strike.
Now, the demands aren't just economic. The union is pushing for explicit protections against ICE access to campus without a judicial warrant, and for guarantees that non-citizen workers forced to leave the country mid-appointment can return to their jobs. At an institution already under siege from the White House, these young workers are refusing to let the administration pick who pays the price. For anyone who ever wondered whether ordinary people can actually beat the federal government in court, they can. This is the story of a wine importer from New York, a toy shop, a cycling gear company, and a lot of nerve. You might remember that the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in February that Trump's sweeping Liberation Day tariffs were unconstitutional, thanks to a case brought not by a major corporation, but by 5 small businesses facing potential bankruptcy, represented pro bono by the Liberty Justice Center. Victor Owen Schwartz, founder of VOS Selections and the lead plaintiff, said the tariffs were arbitrary, unpredictable, and bad for business. The win was real, but the fight isn't over. After the Supreme Court ruling, Trump imposed a new round of tariffs under a separate statute. The Liberty Justice Center, now representing a spice company called Burlap and Barrel and a toy company called Basic Fun, went straight back to court. And this month, a refund portal opened for the more than 330,000 businesses that paid the now illegal tariffs, with an estimated $166 billion owed back. Now, don't get too excited about that one. Right now, it's only open to direct importers and customs brokers, says Wall Street Journal reporter Liz Young.
As far as consumers go, there's no plan right now for how consumers will get refunds. Consumers can't access this portal.
So consumers are out of luck. No portal for us, no checks in the mail, nothing. But here's what also tracks. 5 small businesses just made the Supreme Court tell a sitting president that he doesn't have the power to tax the whole economy by himself. So, we take the wins where we can get them. In early April, New Jersey went to federal court with an emergency motion to stop DHS from converting a warehouse in Roxbury into an immigration detention facility before construction could start as early as this month. The state's legal team made sure the court saw a quote from ICE's own director, who said he wanted deportation to run, quote, like Amazon Prime, but with human beings, end quote. A federal judge in Maryland had already found that a similar warehouse conversion in that state was likely unlawful. New Jersey is now making the same argument with precedent in hand. Governor Mikey Sherrill said the Trump administration had deliberately cut out state and local officials because it knows the impacts are indefensible. The lawsuit is ongoing, but New Jersey's move gives advocates in other states a legal roadmap to fight the administration's facility expansion before the first shovel hits the ground. Immigrant rights groups scored a major legal victory when a federal appeals court struck down Trump's executive order shutting off asylum access at the southern border. The 2-1 ruling said the administration cannot deport migrants using removal procedures it invented itself. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit also held the federal immigration law does not allow the president to suspend migrants' right to apply for asylum. The majority was written by Judge J. Michelle Childs and joined by Judge Cornelia Pillard. Even Trump's own appointee on the panel, Judge Justin Walker, agreed that the administration could not deport migrants to countries where they would face persecution. The case is almost certainly headed to the Supreme Court, but for now, advocates are celebrating the win. Another day, another legal victory. The administration tried to end temporary protected status for people from Ethiopia, a country that is still at war, by claiming conditions there had improved. A federal judge in Massachusetts wasn't buying it. On April 8th, Judge Brian Murphy blocked the administration from ending legal protections for TPS holders from conflict zones. In his ruling, Murphy wrote that the government's claim of improved conditions in countries like Ethiopia defied, quote, common sense. Status and work authorizations remain in place. The case was part of a broader legal offensive by advocates who argued that DHS had been stripping TPS from people legally present in the country by manufacturing optimistic assessments of conditions in war zones and disaster areas. The ruling holds for now, and it was community organizations, immigration lawyers, and plaintiffs willing to put their names on a lawsuit who made it happen. The protests in Minneapolis earlier this year made national news, but what you might not have heard about is how the people in the rest of Minnesota mostly just kept showing up. I gathered these from a variety of local news reports from February through April. In Albert Lea, a small farming and meatpacking town in southern Minnesota, an informal, quiet, multiracial network of locals mobilized as ICE swarmed into their community. They balanced their day jobs with going to the Mexican grocery store to pick up food for families whose breadwinners are afraid to leave home, and patrolling the poorer streets where ICE agents tend to show up, and preparing to drop everything and show up to an active raid at a moment's notice. The same work is being done in rural communities all across Minnesota, from the college town of Northfield to snow-covered Wilmar, from the St. Cloud region to other meat processing towns like Austin. You can't always tell who's part of these networks, and that's part of their power. They're fresh out of college, and they're retirees. They're longtime protesters and people who describe themselves as apolitical who suddenly realized they couldn't sit by idly any longer. In Northfield, Pastor Pam Flickenshire of St. John's Lutheran Church, who was among over 100 faith leaders arrested at a protest at the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport, gave a sermon days later and said, quote, "We are seeing the very best of people in the worst of times," end quote. In Mountain Lake, a farmer named Dwayne Franz has been visiting people detained at the Albert Lea Detention Center about every 2 weeks since last fall through a program called Conversations with Friends. In Faribault, residents organize mutual aid for vulnerable families throughout the months of ICE activity in their community. And none of this is glamorous work, but it's important. And it's a reminder that while ICE isn't in the headlines much anymore, it hasn't gone away. This tidbit was immediately overtaken by shooting news, so I wanted to circle back to it. A couple of days before shots were fired at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, Paramount Skydance CEO David Ellison hosted a separate fancy dinner for Donald Trump that drew dozens of protesters and members of Congress who gathered outside to say what that dinner was actually all about. Maryland Representative Jamie Raskin called it, quote, a lavish oligarch's dinner for Donald Trump, end quote, designed, he said, to cement the Ellisons to the president while their company pursues a $110 billion merger that still needs Justice Department approval. The merger would combine Paramount, which owns CBS News, with CNN parent company Warner Brothers Discovery, consolidating an enormous swath of American media under the Ellisons' control right as they're cozying up to the White House. Vermont Representative Becca Balint and other speakers urged the crowd not to give up on blocking the merger, with many antitrust experts pointing to a coalition of state attorneys general as the most promising avenue to stop it. Nora Misen, founder of Democracy Defenders Action, had the sharpest line of the night. The dinner, he said, quote, resembles a celebration of the First Amendment the same way a book burning is a celebration of the written word, end quote. Then he told the gathered crowd, quote, you are all celebrating the First Amendment by being here, end quote. That's because showing up matters. Thanks for joining me for this month's Tales of the Resistance. It's brought to you by Grab Bag Collab, which you can subscribe to at grabbagcollab.com. This episode was engineered by Amanda Rossman. I'm Amber Hunt, and I'm counting down the days.